Hello everybody, this is XP Walker, and I'm here on the rare event that there's nobody in the house making noise, air conditioner isn't running, kid isn't playing, so I'm gonna fit in as much content as I possibly can for you today. Today, we are not going to be talking about luck catchers. We're not going to be talking about other games that maybe I've posted in the past, like Eco or whatever. We're actually going to be talking about a very old game that no longer technically exists, but had many elements from it that either have never been truly replicated in any other MMO or really have been partially replicated and need to get a lot more love and attention from modern MMO developers. The game I'm talking about, of course, is Star Wars Galaxies. Now, before you quit and say, oh god, it's another Star Wars Galaxies post, it's another video about all the amazing things that Star Wars Galaxies was and all the other MMOs aren't, I would ask that you just wait. I'm not going to sit here and worship the ground that Star Wars Galaxies walked on. It certainly had plenty of issues back in the day. Even the current emulators that are still going and have hundreds of times more players in them than other MMOs that are up and running and are considered modern, such as Luck Catchers, of course. There are still issues, and there were issues that were never addressed, but there were elements of that game that were truly creative and groundbreaking that I think could come back and make new MMOs so much better than they are. Now, before I start, let's talk about an MMO that's coming out. Bless Online, for instance. It's actually not a new MMO. It started in, I think, Japan. It was in Russia. So it did its rounds there. It had pretty poor reviews, pretty cold reception, and they more or less repackaged it and are trying to make it a better game. From what I've seen so far, it does look much better than its older versions, so I'm hoping that it will be at least a fun distraction for a couple months. Kind of has a Black Desert sort of feel to it. It certainly isn't going to be the next MMO that destroys World of Warcraft as much as gamers keep hoping that some MMO will come out and blow their mind. This is certainly not it, but it will be fun, so let's enjoy it. It's only $30. Anyway, that's, again, not what we're here to talk about, so let's get on the actual subject. Star Wars Galaxies. The subject is, what could be relevant to MMOs today that made Star Wars Galaxies so unique, and, dare I say, great for those who loved it. Item number one, content was everywhere in Star Wars Galaxies, meaning obviously it's a Star Wars game, so there's so much lore already behind it before you even get into the game. And if you're a Star Wars fan, I recommend you definitely check out the emulators, at least, even if the game itself is gone. You will just love the music, the throwback to all this wonderful Star Wars lore. It's there. But content in the game was everywhere, all the way from a random NPC you could just walk up to in the city and get a stupid mission for that pays virtually nothing and just gives you some weird loot item that doesn't do anything, to being able to come across the abandoned rebel base on Dantooine or Yavin 4, all these cool things that you could discover in the game. They were everywhere, but they weren't given to you linearly. Linearly? Yeah, I guess linearly would be the word. They were just scattered everywhere, and you had to go find them. There were no directions. There were no maps that said this is exactly where this is, aside from points of interest. You had to travel there with your friends and say, hey, I wonder what this place is. Let's go see what's there. And I think that's something that modern MMOs could definitely do. Now, we're not going to spend too much time yet on discussing what new MMOs could do to be better. First, we're just going to go down the list of some of the great things that were in Star Wars Galaxies, and then we're going to revisit how those things can affect modern MMOs today. So let's just move on to number 2, non-linear content. This is kind of related to the first one, where content was everywhere to discover, but it was non-linear. There was no mission A now leads to mission B, which leads to mission C, and you get a certain amount of XP until your max level. Now go raid. That's the common theme. That's the way that MMOs are just done nowadays. There is no other way to do it as far as developers see, apparently. You just have to do the storyline until you get to the end, and then you raid until forever. That's an MMO, and that's based on World of Warcraft. And like I said, everyone just wants to be World of Warcraft these days, which is really unfortunate for MMOs in general, and I think the reason that the genre is very, very slowly dying right now. So nonlinear was definitely number 2 on the list for one of the great parts about Star Wars. Now later on, when they did the new game enhancements, they did put in a linear quest line, which I could go into a whole story about how I think that was a really dumb idea, but it worked for them, I guess, and the game eventually died, so, say what you will. Number 3 on the list, travel was a major event. Now, this was in the early days of Star Wars Galaxies. I'm 32 years old, so I do remember the early days of Star Wars Galaxies. I was a teenager at the time, I think 14 or 15, I don't remember. And in the early days of Star Wars Galaxies, there were no speeders, there were definitely no spacecraft, although I think those were one of the best additions to the game, jump to lightspeed. You had to literally run where you wanted to go. And mind you, this game was on multiple planets. So the amount of square kilometers in the game was immense. I'm talking putting Skyrim to shame immense. And this is back in 2004, guys. This isn't yesterday or last year. If you wanted to, for example, walk across Corellia, which was sort of the capital planet of the game, it's where all the commerce happened, it would take you hours and hours to get across it. You would usually bring friends because then you could hunt things on the way, you could discover content as you go. It was really cool. Now, pretty early on in the game, they put in speeders, which lets you travel much quicker across the planets in order to get from Starport A to Starport B. They put in shuttles, of course, but I'm probably in the minority here, but I thought that the game before shuttles, the game before speeders, was really cool. It had tons of issues. I mean, there were bugs coming out the wazoo, but one of the cool things that sort of was a unintended bonus to the game was you had to commit serious time to travel anywhere. I think that is a really neat thing, and I'm going to come back to that when we talk about things that new MMOs could do to make themselves set apart or more interesting than just World of Warcraft, which I'm personally not a big fan of. Okay, so number 4, the game was super roleplay friendly. Any of you who played Star Wars Galaxies know there were so many emotes. There were professions that were musicians. Like, that was your profession, was playing music all day long and socializing with people or dancing. Things that young people who come to MMOs now would be like, well, this is a waste of time. I just want to go kill a bunch of bad guys and raid. I think that thought line needs to be reset in the younger MMO players of today. But it was very roleplay friendly. In fact, I've never really roleplayed in any other MMO RPG because it just feels kind of weird and forced. For example, Age of Conan was a game I played after Star Wars disappeared. And I couldn't imagine really role-playing in it because, I mean, I guess I could use my imagination, but there were no emotes or ways to sit down and talk with somebody or act out the part of the wandering barbarian or anything. You just feel kind of silly, like you're really trying hard to have this role-play experience, and it's just ingenuine. But with Star Wars, I remember there were so many people that role-played because there were so many tools to do it. Everywhere you could sit down on, everywhere you could do a bunch of different emotes. I mean, you could go up in a spaceship later on in Jump to Lightspeed and walk around on that spaceship with your friends and sit there and role play the role of a smuggler who has a mission for them to get you some spice. And anyway, I could go on a full hour-long rant about all the really cool roleplay events there were in Star Wars Galaxies, but I will spare you. Maybe I'll do that in another video. But yes, roleplay friendliness, definitely a bonus and an awesome side effect of the way that they built Star Wars Galaxies. Number 5 on my list would be you were a bit player in a very large story. Again, I go back to saying we all know about the lore of Star Wars. We all know about Han Solo, Luke Skywalker, and I won't get into the disaster that is modern day Star Wars films, but we knew what we were getting into when we started the game. We weren't starting as Han Solo. We weren't playing the game as Luke Skywalker. We weren't playing as Lando Calrissian. We were playing as the janitor. We were playing as the stormtrooper who can't hit the broadside of a barn. We were playing as the nobody in a huge story that was much larger than us. And essentially, we were playing as ourselves. you can really put yourself into... well, let me step back and say, I think that one of the best things any MMO can do is convince you that you are living another life and you're living it in your own unique way and no one else is experiencing it quite that way. I have never seen an MMO be able to do that since Star Wars Galaxies, because you're running around, even Elder Scrolls Online, for instance, which is based on a single-player game, Skyrim and all the other Elder Scrolls games, you don't feel like, wow, this is such a cool story and I'm experiencing it my own way, because there's 150,000 other people running around next to you doing the same quest. There's nothing special about it, so it just becomes a grind game, which is... Grinding is essential to any MMO, but it's not very fun when you're just grinding away just to get to the endgame content. Well, this game, Star Wars Galaxies, really made you feel like you were a nobody. And I mean that in a good way, because when you're a nobody, you have nowhere to go but up. You're writing your own story as you go, and it's only getting better with everything that you do. So, Bit Player, that's number 5. Number 6, which is sort of connected to number 5, every experience felt unique. And I kind of already touched on that, but everything you did felt like it was unique to you because you were discovering it as you went. Yes, there were thousands of other players around you doing essentially the same thing, but because there was no quest, there was no storyline, and I'm speaking of the early pre-combat upgrade, pre-NGE Star Wars, because there was no real storyline, there was just sort of content everywhere, and you and your friends just made up what you wanted to do. It felt unique to you. It felt like your experience. I'll give you one of my experiences. Early on in the game, I was playing on a server called Gorath, which I found out later was a European server, which explains why my ping was so terrible. And this was on DSL in its early days, dial-up DSL, ADSL I think it's called. And my friends, I said, hey, we're on Naboo. This is a cool-looking planet. Why don't we take a trip over to Theed, which is like a 2-hour commitment, because we were in Moena, which is in the southern part of Naboo, and Theed is in the northern. I said, hey, let's just start hunting creatures as we go and see what creatures we discover. So me and about 4 other guys, we for 2 hours would just continue on a straight line towards Theed and hunted everything we could find. We killed Fombas, which are those huge creatures with the shields on their back, if you remember from episode, I want to say 1, maybe 2, I don't know. And we killed these cats, and I don't remember the name of all the creatures. I wish I did. And we just had a blast. We just discovered all these cool creatures we didn't know existed just through hunting and just walking from A to B. And it was such a memorable experience. This was over a decade ago, and I still remember it vividly, aside from the names of the creatures. I don't remember those, obviously. But I remember the experience vividly. And I can't tell you any experiences from any other MMO, aside from maybe EVE Online, where I can remember vividly a happening, something that happened so long ago. And that's just something I've never seen replicated in another MMO since, aside from perhaps EVE Online, which again, that's another discussion for another day. But anyway, let's move on to number 7, crafting. And this is the last of my list of things that really made SWG unique. Crafting. I think it is still totally unbeaten in any game. There's so many games that MMOs that they know, the developers know that players care a lot about crafting. So one of the first things they advertise when a game comes out, or when they're first advertising their MMO, oh, this game is going to have some awesome crafting like you've never seen before. We love crafters. And then all the usually ex-SWG guys get excited. Oh, this might be it. This could be the MMO that finally has awesome crafting like Star Wars did. And of course it doesn't. You get MMOs that maybe have generic items that you can craft if you collect the right resources. They have items that you can, like for example, 7 Days to Die. I realize that's not an MMO, but that's one where you can craft things from materials that you pick up. But the recipes are still generic, the ingredients are still generic. Star Wars Galaxies was so unique because the resources would change on a daily basis. You could say, hey, coordinates 25 by 32 by 10 is some amazing copper, and I need this really good copper with this particular stat in a list of 8 different stats that's really high in order to make a good gun. oh, but there's no good steel. But Joe Schmo over there, he got some really good steel last week on another planet. He's willing to trade that steel with me for some of my copper. And then an economy was born, and every item you made was totally unique. In fact, the game had to serialize items, which means when you created an item, a very unique serial number was attached to that item, because every item was slightly different than another, because there's so many variables in crafting an item. So you would get these huge cottage industries that would come up where you would say, well, just for an instance, this is XB craft armor, XB armor. Oh yeah, he's one of the best armor smiths there are. I love his armor. It's the best I've seen. So you'd get these guys who would just get super famous for being good armor smiths or good weaponsmiths, or later on good shipwrights, like myself. I was a pretty good shipwright, I guess. And you would get these this sort of crafting fame on a game. People who maybe never wanted to fight, never really cared about the PvE content, but they loved to craft. That could be a full-time profession for you in the game. Crafting, I don't think that has ever been closely replicated in another game since. To this day, there is no game that comes close to the quality of the crafting game in Star Wars Galaxies. And I might make another video where we just talk about crafting and all the amazing things that it had and how they might be relevant for another game today. But again, I'm trying to keep this video 30 minutes or less. Otherwise, you guys don't have the attention span. I don't think you could pay attention beyond 30 minutes. There's actually an interesting psychological paper done about how people are so programmed for commercials that if you sit them down in front of a movie or a speech or any sort of thing where they have to sit in one place and watch something for 30 minutes, every 5 to 7 minutes, people start fidgeting. And for about a minute after that, their attention span drifts before it comes back, because we've been so programmed to watch commercials. But anyway, that's, again, I'm getting off subject. I think that's just kind of interesting. So now we're going to move on to the portion of this video where I'm going to talk about what can we bring to new MMOs. What have we learned from Star Wars Galaxies that we could put in new MMOs that maybe has not been done fully or to its full potential yet? Number one on that list is what I call canvas gameplay. What that means is there's going to be lots of content in the game, but maybe not a lot of leadership, or not. That's not the word. Maybe not a lot of game guiding into that content. Now that seems like suicide for any modern game. Making a game with absolutely no tutorial or no way for the players to know how to do anything will likely destroy a game. I give you, for example, luck catchers, which certainly that was one of the major complaints of the game, was there was no tutorial, there was nothing. There's no way for players to know what to do. The most hardcore players were the ones who stuck around and just learned it the hard way. I'm not saying that if you want your MMO to be successful, you shouldn't have a tutorial. I think that is actually a bad idea, because people they aren't the people that played games 15 years ago. It's a different crowd. So I do think that games should have tutorials, but I think that... Oh, hold on, I gotta fix my mic here. It slowly falls over 10 minutes. Anyway, I think that something can be said for putting a lot of content in a game that maybe is not talked about. There's a dungeon somewhere where the game never actually leads you there. You and your friends need to find it. And there's all sorts of content spread throughout the map that there's absolutely no guides for. I mean, players will write their own guides, of course, once they find it, but there's content everywhere that the players had to tell other players about. Or, perhaps procedurally generated content that changes weekly. I don't know. I'm not a developer, so I couldn't really give you the technicals of what I mean by that. But perhaps dungeons that change and their locations change, but they're very popular. They're very effective. They make your character stronger by going there more than a normal dungeon would be. And that week, the secret is, we got to try to keep this a secret. Don't tell any other guilds about it until someone discovers it. And anyway, I could go on and on about that, but I think canvas gameplay is something that developers should really look into doing for their games. Don't just give players all the content. Make them have to find it. Make them have to discover it. Again, I go back to Skyrim as a perfect example. Yes, There were guides out there. Every single dungeon in that game has been very, very fully covered and talked about and put into different guides. But one of the best ways to experience that game was to just go out and play it. Don't read any guides on how to play it. It is such a fun game that way because you're discovering all these cool places and you're discovering there's so many dungeons and little instances that have nothing to do with the storyline. I think MMOs could learn a lot from Skyrim in that sense. Number 2, large maps are great. Now, a lot of MMOs love to say, oh, we have huge maps, but you fast travel everywhere. So what's the point of a huge map if I can go from A to B in half a second? The huge map doesn't really mean anything. Let's talk about Elder Scrolls, for instance. I can use a way shrine to go anywhere I want. And yeah, the maps are vast. They're beautiful too. It's a very pretty game. But there's no experience of running from A to B. I could just take a way shrine everywhere I need to go, and I'm missing out on all this content. There should be fast travel between main locations, like capital cities, for instance, or your guild hall and some other major location. But I think something can be said for having a game where even going from one place to another is a challenge. You know, think of a medieval what's the country I'm thinking of? Medieval England. You know, if a king sent his troops to go fight in northern France, they couldn't, if they lost the battle, they couldn't just fast travel back to Yorkshire or something. They had to march back. They had to take a boat across the sea. They had to come back. News got to him a week after the defeat had happened. Think of what it would be like in a game if something like that existed. Obviously, we have things like Discord and TeamSpeak and whatever where we could instantly tell each other what's going on. Oh, I lost. I'm on my way back. But imagine if sending a team from your guild to go do a dungeon was a day-long adventure. Not meaning like you'd have to play for a day because we all have lives and jobs. But if you decided to go to this place, you're going to be in this place and its surrounding areas for a long time because it's a major time commitment to get there. I think that would do a lot towards contributing to players a feeling of vastness to a map. Oftentimes when I play MMOs, I don't do fast travel because I want to discover the things between cities. I want to discover all this area that the developers have worked so hard to create. I think that putting in a system that more or less bans fast travel except for major locations, I think that would be really cool for an MMO if the developers marketed that. If you spring that on the players, they're going to be upset. But if you tell them, hey, this MMO, there's very little fast travel, you're going to have to really commit if you want to go from this place to that place. If you throw it at them up front and you don't surprise them with it, I think that players will warm up to the idea far before they actually play the game, and it will become an endearing part of that game. Number 3, which of course connects back to what I was talking about for Star Wars Galaxies, I think that social events such as meaningless jobs, mini games, emotes, and interactable furniture instead of just a bunch of eye candy, I think that would go a long way towards making an MMO feel like an actual massive experience. Having all these social tools that perhaps have very little to do with character development, but have so much to do with the player development. There's character development and there's player development. Character development, all MMOs do fairly well. They have a linear storyline, you get through it, you get to raids, and then the rest of the time is spent getting raid gear. But player development is something that's been practically lost in modern MMOs. Look at games like, well, I struggle to even call this a game, but Second Life. Now, Second Life is almost abandoned at this point, but one thing they had that they did really well was it was truly a Second Life. You could build anything, you could have a business in that game, you could own land. And for a time in the early 2000s, Second Life was a big deal. I mean, there were companies that were advertising in the game. There was all sorts of outside interest in this really weird game that was not actually a game, but literally a Second Life. I think that there are some things that could be taken from that game, such as giving the players a second life. Give them menial jobs. Give them dumb things to do that don't really contribute to player progression, but make them feel like they're doing something that's unique to them. Or make them feel like they're actually experiencing an MMO rather than just playing it. And this next point, point number 4, sort of plays off of point number 3, and that's put the player in a story where they don't play a typical hero. They don't have to be a hero. The players don't have to be Captain America or Iron Man. They can be the soldier number 3, or they could be the red shirt, because the less importance you place on the character and who they are, the more the player can assume the role, the more the player can create the role. If I'm playing Han Solo, I'm not playing as XB Walker. I'm playing as Han Solo. Okay? If I'm playing as post-NGE Jedi, I'm playing as a Jedi. I'm not playing as XB Walker the Jedi, because I'm on a very linear path. But if you put the players in this world and from the get-go you tell them, hey, you're not important. You're a nobody. You have to forge your own path, and oh, by the way, all these heroes and all these great guys are doing stuff around you. You can't be them. You have to decide who you want to be, and you have to make your own way in this world. I could get into a political discussion about how everything is handed to the younger generation nowadays, and we don't know what it's like to have any sort of struggle, but I'll stay out of that. That's a video for probably an entirely different channel. But there's nothing wrong, developers, with telling the players, you're a nobody, you have to make yourself into somebody, and you'll never be that titular hero. You'll be your own guy, whether it be a crafter who never does get famous, or whether it be a millionth level mage who is the best on the server. Whatever. That's up to you to do. I think that that's something that's almost completely lost in MMOs, and I really hope it comes back, making the players bit players. Last but not least, and I already discussed this, so I'll make this part short, crafting. Please. I don't like to say mirror what SWG did to future developers. I don't want to say just do what they did, because that's not creative at all. But in this instance, I almost want to say SWG's way of doing crafting was almost perfect. They had such a cool system, serialized items, changing resources, an entire world of mini games for crafting. I think that's all just awesome. So I'm not saying be just like Star Wars Galaxies, but I am saying take a lot of the influence from those games and look at how they did crafting. Don't be afraid to 80 or 90% mimic what they did for crafting, because it was so well done. And even today, it holds up as the best crafting system ever surmised, in my opinion. Of course, this is all my opinion, so you don't have to believe a word I say. You can go on making cheesy, linear, let's pay a subscription for 3 months, MMOs, and then on to the next thing. That's fine. You can keep doing that, and you can keep slowly killing the genre, or you can be an actual trendsetter and do something new, or in this case, take some of the ideas that worked in Galaxies and apply them to modern day MMOs. One other thing that I didn't mention, because it's sort of included in the social stuff, is player housing. A lot of games like to say they do player housing, and I think that started with Star Wars Galaxies, maybe EverQuest, but none of them has really done a good job. They do instance housing, which is okay, I guess, but I think there's something to be said for player housing on the open world map. You're running along and Joe Blow's house is right there next to you as you walk by it. There should be certain zones you can't build in, of course. You don't want garbage houses all over the place ruining the immersion in the game. But I think having real player housing where you can say, hey, let's literally walk to my house and let me show you this cool design I have. I think that would be great to have in modern day MMOs. I haven't seen it yet. Star Wars Galaxies did luxury yachts where you could be in space flying around and your friends would be on your ship walking around, socializing, sitting in the chairs, playing on a jukebox. They actually had jukeboxes in the game. There's all this stuff, and I've never seen that in other MMOs. They just have these ships on rails, for instance, the Old Republic Online, or no space combat at all, or this sort of arena type combat if you look at Star Trek Online. It's never been repeated, and it seems to me that the technology has to be there. I mean, if it was there in the early 2000s, it certainly hasn't gone backwards, right? So anyway, that's all I have to say. I'm trying to keep this video roughly 30 minutes. Please leave a comment in the comments if you have something you want to add. I'll try to respond to you. And if you want to troll me, I'll try not to respond to you. And if you want to see more videos like this, perhaps related specifically to Star Wars Galaxies, let me know. Or bring up another MMO that you've played that you think had some elements of it that were terrific and could be used in future MMOs. I've played many of them. I can't say I've played every MMO that's ever existed, but I've always been sort of a massively multiplayer junkie. And like many of my ex-Star Wars Galaxies friends, I've been chasing that high of Star Wars Galaxies ever since I left it. You know, it was my first love as far as MMOs go, and I've never quite hit it. I probably never will. I mean, you can't relive nostalgia, but you can bring elements of it into the modern day. So leave a comment. Thank you guys for watching. And if the quality of this video sucks, well, I'm not a video editor. You want to be my video editor, drop me a message. I'd love to have someone who actually edits these videos rather than my poor, crappy attempts at it. Thanks a lot, guys, and I will talk to you later. This is XB, signing off.